for children of narcissists, how do you set boundaries? How do you take space? How do you validate your own needs without feeling like it's hurting or harming the other person? Because I think that's a huge one when people take space or they want to do something different or they know that they can't spend all of their holidays around their family. They actually can only spend one day and then the rest they need to do something for themselves. I can see how that now adult child might say to themselves, oh no, but like they're going to be so sad. Is that my fault? And what do I do about that? Will they hate me? Will I no longer have a relationship with them? What do you recommend there?
Yeah, that is a huge part of treatment right there. What you just named is this sense of guilt. And I would call it like toxic guilt, really, because it's
Mm,
not, taking space for yourself and limiting the time that you spend with your narcissistic parent. All of that is very healthy and very, quote, normal behavior, right? There's nothing egregious about that. And toxic guilt really has no resolution. It's like, I
mm,
feel bad. And if the answer, if I always kind of ask people this, like, would that guilt resolve if you were to spend more time with them? And would it resolve in a way where you feel good and you
mm,
feel like you're in your authentic self? And
mm,
usually the answer is no. No,
mm,
I wouldn't feel good if I resolved that guilt. I would actually just feel worse because now I'm spending more time with this person and I don't want to.
mm,
So I think the first part is recognizing that toxic guilt is the legacy of growing up with a narcissistic parent, of believing you're
mm,
responsible for something that you're not. And this can sometimes maybe sound a little harsh at first, but if a narcissistic parent might be sad, that's a place where we get to look at, like, how is that to actually allow someone to be sad and not take responsibility for it? And I think that's
mm,
just like such a new concept for people. What? I could just like let someone be sad? That feels so kind of mean.
mhm,
But we're not talking about being mean to someone when they're sad. It's just letting them have their own emotional experience without attaching our own need to, quote, fix it or change it or feel responsible for it. And narcissistic parents will make you feel responsible for it. That's just what they're going to do. And I think there is something to be said about when you can really see that mechanism happening, you realize that it's coming from a very dysregulated part within themselves. It really isn't
mm,
about you doing something wrong. It's that they don't get the narcissistic supply that they need when you pull away, when you have
mm,
boundaries, and that can feel threatening to them. So
mm,
I think that's one kind of central focus is really getting clear on when is something healthy guilt? Like, for instance, like if I don't call a friend on their birthday and they're sad and I feel bad, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry. That was not what I meant to do. And I make it up to that person. They feel better. I feel better. We're good. With toxic guilt, there really isn't that reparative process. It's more like
mhm.
a subjugation of your sense of self. Like, I have to go now serve my parent and make them happy until they sort of, release me from that duty. So it's a very kind of different
Yeah.
dynamic.
Yeah, in that guilt framework, it's almost like I cannot honor my needs while also honoring, like both of our needs cannot be met in this dynamic. Either I compromise mine for you or you're unhappy and I get my needs met.
100%. Yes.
Mhm.
And then you were touching on like boundaries. I mean, one way I think of boundaries is they're not always about asking the other person to change. They can be. That can be part of a boundary setting, but
Mm,
the way I think about it with adult children of narcissists, it's the ways in which you are going to take care of yourself and
mm,
meet your needs and put limitations around your own energy. Sometimes framing it as like my boundaries aren't about punishing the narcissist or punishing anyone. They're really the tools that I use to meet my own needs and allow myself to be a separate person. Adult children of narcissists have learned to be the extension of their parent. It's almost like they weren't allowed to be a separate self with needs and feelings and desires and wants. And so
mm,
boundaries are a great way to remind us that we are separate and we do have limitations, and that's perfectly okay. It's necessary. to protect ourselves. I always think of like the skin. Our skin is the ultimate boundary, right? It's like literally protecting our inner organs and our body. Our boundaries are that. They're protective. They're not punitive. They protect us and they help us meet our needs and allow us to take care of our emotional, physical, all the needs that we have, essentially.
Mhm. One thing we were talking about before we recorded is almost like these traps or these baits that narcissistic set to kind of get that narcissistic supply. And if you could touch on what that is too. But I think about my interactions that I've had with people like that. And it's almost like you're trying to set boundaries with someone who you think is operating the same as you. And you run into a wall. They, will explain how that's selfish or being too sensitive. You have this all wrong. Gaslighting comes out. There's all these tactics, and then you maybe start second guessing yourself. But I think understanding what are their limitations and where you're setting that boundary. You had the best post on it. I'm gonna have to like link your entire Insta, all of your
I
posts
love
for
it.
this. So good. But I think that clarified, oh, I have historically tried to set boundaries with this personality type in not the wrong way, but extensively an ineffective way, in a way that like they would never be able to understand nor meet that. So how can you kind of break that down a little bit?
Well, first part, narcissistic supply is any kind of reaction from another person that fuels their self esteem, that gives them admiration, validation. I mean, even like guilt tripping someone where the person might say something like, no, I didn't mean that. No, I really do think this about you. It's just another way of getting that supply. This might sound sort of like a funny way of putting it, but narcissists are kind of vampiric in a way, right? They will feed off of another person's life force to sustain themselves. So when I think of narcissistic supply, I kind of think of it in terms of like a vampire, right? I need to suck your blood to stay alive. In this case, it's like I need to get a reaction from you so that my false sense of self can remain intact and I don't have to feel all those uncomfortable feelings that I avoid. So that's kind of the first part of narcissistic supply. When we're setting boundaries, we often think we're setting them with someone who kind of would see it the way we see it, but narcissists don't. There is always going to be some kind of retaliatory comeback. So if you were to set a boundary, they could say, "Oh, is that something your therapist taught you?" Really just trying to find something to use to devalue you. With narcissistic folks, we do have to change our expectations of them. They are not going to be the type of people who can go, "Oh, thanks for telling me. Yep, not a problem. I will honor that boundary," right? That's just not who they are. Boundaries are huge threats to them because,
Mm,
again, it's that cutting off narcissistic supply. So I think one thing to be aware of is when you're setting a boundary to make sure that you are making it very clear in yourself, what is the need that I am meeting? And I
mm,
always think our needs need to be non negotiable. I am not going to sacrifice my need for independence in this way. I am going to meet that need, and here's what I'm going to do. So, really keeping the boundary setting very simple and to the point. I think one trap narcissists try to pull you into is to get you to justify and explain yourself. And if that's happening, just come back to what the boundary is and stick to it. And so within a boundary, I think of like internal and interpersonal boundaries. Like there's the interpersonal boundary of, I'm not going to engage with you if you start name calling. And so if you want to continue this conversation, I would ask you to stop using that word with me. That's kind of like an interpersonal boundary. And then an internal boundary is sort of like the standards we set for ourselves. I'm not going to take phone calls after 8 p.m. My internal boundary is like, I need to get my rest, and phone calls after 8 p.m. just sort of disrupt that. So sort of thinking of it in those terms, like what's the interpersonal boundary and what's the internal boundary? And just continuing to come back to this concept of I am going to meet my needs. And it doesn't mean you have to be rigid. Sometimes there's room for compromise if you're working with someone, if the narcissist in your life maybe is more on the mild side, on the less severe side. But at the end of the day, we want to make it really clear what our intentions are and how we're going to meet our needs and really do our best to not get into any kind of justification, explanation traps, because they're going to want to put you in that place, which is where they can undermine your boundaries altogether. And you might even go like, well, screw it. This isn't even worth having. So
Mm.
just holding those principles in mind is super key.
Talk about the gray rocking method. What is
Yeah.
that, and how can that help you navigate when you are interacting with the narcissist in your life?
Yeah, gray rocking is a term in which you essentially become as boring as a gray rock to a
Mm.
narcissist because going back to narcissistic supply, they want your buy in to their story. They want a reaction out of you. And when you can respond in a gray rocking fashion, that cuts them off from being able to get anything from you.
Mm.
So responding with like one word, it's like, uh huh, yeah, okay, basically not giving them anything to work with.
Mm.
There is another term, it's also called yellow rocking,
Mm.
in which maybe you don't go, no, yes, okay, right? That maybe doesn't feel quite authentic to you. You can still bring a level of warmth to your interactions and still maintain this simple, I'm not going to give you a lot of information, a lot of reaction responses. So maybe it would look like, oh, okay, cool, right? As opposed to just like, okay. So there's a little kind of
Mm.
gradation there. I think gray rocking is a great tool to use when you have to engage with a narcissist for a long period of time, or even if you have to just talk to them briefly. Honestly, it can be used in any sort of context. So that's another tool to use to just protect yourself from being mined for supply and reaction. And it just closes you off from that, really.
I think too about, especially children of narcissists are so maybe attuned or hyper aware of any sort of like selfish behavior or putting their needs first or caretaking themselves. And I think there's also just a fear of like not wanting to be their parent. What are some signs, especially if you grew up around a narcissist, you're going to be so hyper aware of certain of those behaviors. I feel like that's one of the first things a lot of people of children of narcissists ask is like, wait, am I one too? I want to set boundaries. Does that mean I'm selfish? What are some ways of dealing with that fear of being too selfish and almost overcorrecting by lack of boundaries, etc.?
Yeah, that's a very common question. Am I becoming a narcissist by setting boundaries, by saying no to people, by limiting my interactions? I always come back to first and foremost, a narcissist is not wondering if they're a narcissist.
Mm,
Right? So you can always come back to that piece. No narcissistic person is going like, am I a narcissist? And then caring about the answer. If they
mm,
ever do ask themselves that question, they might go, I probably am, but who cares? I think that's the first piece is like a narcissist is not concerned about being a narcissist. This notion of like, is it selfish to set boundaries? I always flip it to, is this act self-caring?
mm,
Because selfish always implies that we're, again, doing what a narcissist does, meeting our needs at someone else's expense, versus self-caring is recognizing that I am a separate person and I have needs and energy levels that have to be maintained and preferences. And I'm always kind of struck because folks who are concerned that they're being selfish actually wouldn't say that someone else, like a friend of theirs who was setting a boundary, was being selfish. They would actually see
mm,
that as, oh no, they're taking care of themselves. So I think
mhm,
one way to frame it is to sort of ask yourself, would I hold that same standard to anyone else in my life? If my child wanted to set a boundary, would I think, oh my God, they're being selfish?
mm,
Most people say no. Most people
mhm,
could go, no, I recognize that that's a really healthy thing for them to do. So the first part is remembering narcissists don't really care that they're narcissists. And setting boundaries is self-caring. It's
mhm,
part of how we move through the world. Sometimes this does come down to doing a little like exposure work. What
mm,
happens if I set a boundary? Does my
mhm,
relationship with my friend completely disintegrate? Usually the answer is no. The other person is happy to know where we stand and what we need and wants to largely support us in our boundaries. And so I think being able to safely sort of explore that and see what happens when I actually set a boundary can be really eye opening. that thing didn't happen. I didn't just like turn into a selfish narcissist. Oh, I'm actually more available, more attentive to other people now that I've had this boundary met inside of me. So there's a lot of, a lot of layers to kind of work through in that. But ultimately, framing it as a self caring practice, I think can be really helpful.